What is going on, everyone? My name is Nick, or the Notorious Fantasy, and in today's video, we're going to be talking about my top 12 Dynasty wide receivers for the 2022 Dynasty Fantasy Football season. Inside today's video, I'll be going in depth into my top 12 wide receivers, as well as explaining into why I have them ranked at each and every single spot inside the top 12. But before we could get into things, I would like to ask, if you are new to the channel and you do end up enjoying today's video, to please make sure that you hit that subscribe button down below. Not only is it free, we put out content every single day to try to help you guys out a ton in terms of everything fantasy football. And if you are new to the channel or not, please make sure that you do hit that like button down below. It would help us out a ton. And if you would like to follow me on Twitter, please do so at Notorious FNTSY. So without further ado, let's get into my top 12 Dynasty wide receivers. We begin at number 1 with Ja'Marr Chase, wide receiver of the Cincinnati Bengals, who is currently 22 years old. Now, I think there is going to be a very strong consensus at who is going to be the number 1 and number 2 wide receiver off the board in a majority of Dynasty fantasy football leagues. Now, both of those wide receivers just so happen to play at LSU. Let me know down below in the comment section if you would like who you guys would be taking as the number 1 wide receiver off the board if you were doing a 2022 Dynasty fantasy football draft. Would it be Ja'Marr Chase or would it be Justin Jefferson, who is my number 2 wide receiver for Dynasty fantasy football? So we begin obviously with Ja'Marr Chase. Number 1 was a rookie last year, and there was a lot going into Ja'Marr Chase's rookie year. There were all these narratives that were basically pointing away from why you shouldn't draft Ja'Marr Chase, and maybe not why you shouldn't draft him, but why you should kind of temper your expectations for earlier on in the season, because things were coming out that this man can't see an NFL football, that he needs those white stripes that are on an NCAA collegiate football to see the football. So that obviously sounds really fucking bad when you read it. This guy can't catch an NFL football. And then you're watching preseason, and it doesn't look like the Ja'Marr Chase you saw in 2019 at LSU. And you're reading all these things that are negative for Ja'Marr Chase, and in my head, I'm just thinking, you know what? I'm fine drafting Ja'Marr Chase, but I fully understand that this man might not be great for 5, 6, 7, 8 weeks of the season. Maybe it takes him a little bit of time to get acclimated, because again, remember, he didn't play at all in 2020 for the LSU Tigers. He ended up opting out of the season for COVID, and then just went into the 2021 NFL Draft. So there was a lot of potential worries about Ja'Marr Chase, a lot of things that were pointing negatively for him, and instead of all that negativity actually coming to fruition, he plays in 17 games, and he's one of the best wide receivers in fantasy football, one of the best wide receivers in the National Football League. In 2021, 128 targets, 7.5 per game, ranking 17th at wide receiver, 81 receptions, 4.8 per game, ranking 18th at wide receiver, 1,455 receiving yards, 85.6 per game, ranking 4th at wide receiver, and 13 total touchdowns, number 4 at wide receiver. Again, any negativity that was spit towards Ja'Marr Chase was wrong. Everything was wrong. That connection from LSU was that 5G LTE shit, because Ja'Marr Chase and Joe Burrow were torching the league. Everyone talking about they got to draft Penny Sewell, they shouldn't draft Ja'Marr Chase, was fucking wrong, because they make their way to the Super Bowl. Now, is there a good chance in 2022 that this team retracts, they go back down, they don't make the Super Bowl? I think yes, there's a very good chance, because even those teams like the Chiefs that you feel like are almost a lock to make the Super Bowl, a lock to go to the AFC Championship, sometimes they don't make it that far. Sometimes these colossal teams that are amazing, they don't make it there. So would it surprise me if the Bengals made it back? Of course not, but I think they're going to have a worse year than last year, which makes sense, because having a worse year just means they don't make the Super Bowl. But even if they don't have this insane postseason success, doesn't mean that Ja'Marr Chase is going to fall off a cliff. In Dynasty Fantasy Football, I look in a couple of ways. I'm looking for a wide receiver that I think is good, that I think is young. I match that in there, you know, how young are they, to kind of adjust the rankings, how old they are. And then I'm also looking towards the team around him. How is this team going to forecast for the future? And I look at Dynasty Fantasy Football in a 2-3 year window. I'm not trying to project how Ja'Marr Chase is going to look 10 fucking years from now, because in my opinion, that's pretty dumb, because in Dynasty Fantasy Football leagues, most leagues don't make it 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 years, right? They just make it maybe 2-3 years. So I'm looking at a 2-3 year window here, and Ja'Marr Chase is going to be with Joe Burrow for the next 2 to 3 years. He's the number 1 wide receiver on the Cincinnati Bengals. But Nick, they have T. Higgins. They have these other wide receivers. I understand T. Higgins is going to get the ball as well. There are going to be some games where Ja'Marr Chase plays worse, because T. Higgins has an amazing game, and that's okay because I am buying into the guy for the long term, and I believe that Ja'Marr Chase could easily maintain the value of the number one wide receiver in fantasy football going forward for dynasty purposes. Last year, he had 17.9 fantasy points per game in half PPR, ranking 5th at the wide receiver position, so I really do think that Ja'Marr Chase is set up for success in the future. Next up, we move to my number 2 wide receiver, again, another LSU wide receiver, and that is the gritty man himself, Justin Jefferson of the Minnesota Vikings, 23.1 years old, slightly older than Ja'Marr Chase. Again, the only real way that a wide receiver is going to get a huge knockdown on his age if I think things are just going to fall off the edge of the earth in the next 2-3 years. So at number 2, obviously, Justin Jefferson, 23.1 years old, obviously a very young wide receiver. In his season last year in 2021, 167 targets, 9.8 per game, ranking 4th at wide receiver, 108 receptions, 6.4 per game, ranking 4th at wide receiver, 1,616 receiving yards, 95.1 per game, ranking 2nd at wide receiver, 10 total touchdowns, 7th at wide receiver. Now, the biggest difference to me between Ja'Marr Chase and Justin Jefferson is not really the skill. These are 2 excellent wide receivers, 2 of the best wide receivers in the NFL. The biggest difference is the quarterback situation. In Cincinnati, you're locked and loaded with Joe Burrow. In Minnesota, is it going to be Kirk Cousins for the future? Is this the last year of Kirk Cousins? Is he the starting quarterback in 2022? Now, most would say yes, but I think that is still a relatively unknown thing. In 2021, Justin Jefferson averaged 19.4 fantasy points per game, number 4 at wide receiver. So Justin Jefferson is going to probably be great, even if it's not Kirk Cousins in the future, right? But that's something you kind of want to bake in a little bit. I think that Justin Jefferson is going to be great. I'm not trying to sit here and berate him. Oh, he's my number 2 wide receiver. This is why Ja'Marr Chase is so much better than him, because that's a stupid fucking argument to have, because Justin Jefferson is one of the best wide receivers in the NFL, and you could easily make the argument that he is the best in terms of dynasty fantasy football. So I love Justin Jefferson. Again, all of the stats, all of the noteworthy things that you want a receiver to have. You want them to get a lot of targets, you want them to get a lot of receiving yards, and you want them to turn those into touchdowns. Now, are touchdowns predictable in the NFL? No. They're not predictable at all. Maybe Justin Jefferson just had an excellent year because he scored 10 touchdowns, but in his rookie year in 2020, he scored 7 touchdowns. So I wouldn't think there's going to be that much fluctuation going from 10 to 4 touchdowns next year. I think he's still going to be a relatively involved player inside the red zone. So I like Justin Jefferson a ton. Again, wide receiver number 2. At number 3, this is where we get to the point where it's how far down can you knock down the guy that, in my opinion, might be just the best receiver in the NFL. Now, again, there's going to be a lot of narrative, and this player is Cooper Kupp, wide receiver of the LA Rams, 28.7 years old. The narrative will be, oh, they just won the Super Bowl. They're going to go deep down. They're going to play like shit next year, right? Cooper Kupp's not going to be able to put up these fantastic stats, right? Last year, Cooper Kupp, number 1 in targets, number 1 in receptions, 191 targets, 11.2 per game. 145 receptions, 8.5 per game. He was number 1 in receiving touchdowns, number 1 in receiving yards, 1,947 receiving yards, 114.5 per game. Number 1 at wide receiver, 16 total touchdowns, 17 games played, number 1 at wide receiver in terms of total touchdowns. This guy is fucking amazing. And could things go down 100%? They should go down. When you have a year like that, where this may be the best wide receiver season of all time, maybe you consider Calvin Johnson to be the best receiving year of all time. I'm not here to make some type of an argument. What I'm saying is that's one of the best wide receiver years ever a wide receiver has had. So I don't think sitting here and telling you that this guy's just going to fall off the edge of the earth makes a lot of sense, because even if he has a worse season, maybe he finishes as the wide receiver 3 instead of wide receiver 1. So I think it is very smart to rank him as the number 3 wide receiver. Some people may knock him down because of his age, but when you have a guy that's as good as Cooper Kupp, that could be good for the next 3-4 seasons, I see no reason to kind of push him down the rankings because of his age. Next up at number 4, we move to Deebo Samuel, wide receiver of the San Francisco 49ers, 26.1 years old for Mr. Deebo Samuel. Now, Deebo Samuel had an all-right 2020, an all-right rookie year in 2019, but in 2021 is really when Deebo Samuel elevated himself from not just some wide receiver in the NFL, right? Because a lot of people they were singing the praises of Deebo Samuel, but they weren't talking about him as being one of the best receivers in the NFL. And it's pretty clear that maybe he's not the best just receiver, but the amount of touches this guy's going to see every single game, because the rushing opportunity he's going to receive, even with McDaniel leaving there, you just have to be all in on Deebo Samuel. In 2021, again, he's 26.1 years old, 120 targets, 7.5 per game, 21st at wide receiver, 77 receptions, 4.8 per game, 21st at wide receiver, 1,405 receiving yards, 87.8 per game, 5th at wide receiver, 59 rushes for 365 rushing yards. Most receivers not going to rush for 300 plus yards, obviously. 14 total touchdowns, including receiving and rushing. Number 2 at wide receiver. Deebo Samuel gets just such a boost in my mind for how good this offense is in San Francisco. I understand Jimmy Garoppolo is going to be gone. It's going to be Trey Lance. Why would Trey Lance not rely on one of the best players on the team? Why would the team phase away from Deebo Samuel? When you see a guy that goes out there that's as athletic, as skilled, just a guy that you can just give the ball to, whether you hand it to him, whether you throw it to him, you create these screens, you create scenarios on the football field to give this man the fucking ball because he's so good. So Deebo Samuel is one of the better wide receivers in terms of Dynasty Fantasy Football. And again, it is basically kind of hard to argue past the 1 and 2. So 1 and 2, Jamar Chase, Justin Jefferson. I feel like those guys are locked in. Maybe you have Jefferson 1, maybe you have Jamar Chase's 2, but I think those guys are the clear top 2. And then after that, you can kind of make the argument Deebo might be number 3, or you can make the argument that some other wide receiver I talk about later could be higher up, because I think there's really a clear 1-2 punch, but I think after that, it is really an open argument to have, an open discussion to have. So if you guys feel a little bit different than me, don't feel like you're looking the wrong way or that I'm crazy or something, because these guys are really close in my head. Next up, we move to Jaylen Waddle, wide receiver of the Miami Dolphins. If I didn't mention it for Deebo Samuel, he did have a grand total of 21.2 fantasy points per game, 3rd at wide receiver, and Cooper Kupp at 25.9 per game, ranking number 1 at wide receiver. So number 5 again, Jaylen Waddle, Waddle the way, Waddle. Wide receiver of the Miami Dolphins, 23.2 years old. In 2021, in his rookie year, he had 142 targets, 8.9 per game, ranking 10th at wide receiver, 104 receptions, 6.5 per game, ranking 7th at the wide receiver position, 1,015 receiving yards, 63.4 per game, ranking 22nd at wide receiver, and 7 total touchdowns, 18th at wide receiver. Now, originally, when I was going to dive into the numbers of Jaylen Waddle, I actually perceived that he was going to have more rushing opportunities than I thought he did, and he didn't have as many. But I would anticipate that with Mike McDaniel being the head coach of the Miami Dolphins, that he's not necessarily the next Deebo Samuel, but that he is very heavily ingrained in getting rushing opportunities on the team. When he did rush the ball for Miami, he was very successful at that. So I think this Dolphins team is going to be very much revamped in 2022. Now, I'm a Dolphins fan, but I wouldn't consider myself to be some type of a fanboy, a stan of a way, where I'm just going to get on here and just fucking lie about a guy because he's on my favorite team, right? I don't really put too much bias into these videos. So when I'm talking about Jaylen Waddle, I'm trying to talk about him objectively. I really do believe that with head coach Mike McDaniel and with a better offensive line, this team is going to be better. Now, Nick, how do you say they're going to have a better offensive line? Maybe they just don't. That's possible. But if McDaniel wants to have a fucking job in the future, he's going to bring in a better offensive line. Jaylen Waddle is going to be the Deebo player, the athletic player, the skill player, the guy you get the football to. I believe that Tua is going to take a leap up. Is Tua going to be a top 5 quarterback in the NFL? Probably not. But I think with the better offensive line, the better offensive-minded head coach, that he will be able to flourish. I think Jaylen Waddle will be great. Jaylen Waddle was good when Tua wasn't playing amazing. So just think how better that Jaylen Waddle could be if Tua maybe doesn't go to amazing level, but he goes from good to great. Maybe he's a top 12 quarterback, right? Then you can definitely see Jaylen Waddle having an even better season than in 2021. Last year, he was wide receiver 15 in terms of fantasy points per game, 15.4. Now, the reason why I really smash the hammer in on the fact of the fantasy points per game is because when you're looking at the points per game number, it is less skewed. Meaning that I think that the regular finish season total is very skewed because say you miss like 3-4 games, there's no way you're going to be cracking the top 10 unless you have some crazy year like Michael Thomas where you see like 15 fucking receptions a game, something crazy like that. At number 6, we move to Tyreek Hill, wide receiver of the Kansas City Chiefs, 28.0 years old. Now, again, we're going back to these old heads. Is Tyreek Hill that old? Of course not, right? He's only been in the NFL since, I believe, 2016, so it's not like he's this guy that's been in the league since 2010, but getting up there in age, but he's kind of hooked onto the Chiefs. Most likely, the next couple of years, he's going to be on the Chiefs. One of the best quarterbacks in the NFL, probably the best quarterback in the NFL. He's going to be just fine. 2021 stats, 159 targets, I should say. I apologize. 9.4 per game, ranking 7th at wide receiver. 111 receptions, 6.5 per game, ranking 3rd at wide receiver. 1,239 receiving yards, 72.9 per game, ranking 6th at wide receiver. 9 total touchdowns. He averaged 17.4 fantasy points per game, ranking 6th at wide receiver. The year prior, he was number 2 in fantasy points per game. This Kansas City Chiefs offense, it may add a new weapon. May add Juju Smith-Schuster, may bring someone in the draft, but it doesn't fucking matter. They have Travis Kelce, and yet Tyreek Hill, year in and year out, is amazing. You can't guard Tyreek Hill. The guy's too fast unless you're Eli Apple and you yank him down on like the 1-yard line to end the second half, and then you inevitably choke away your chances of going to the Super Bowl. But, you know, not some Bengals fan. I just thought that was kind of funny to note. So Tyreek Hill, obviously, amazing. There's not too much to add about a guy like Tyreek Hill, right? Everyone knows just how fucking good this guy. Everyone knows that this guy is a potential game breaker on your fantasy football team. There are only a couple of wide receivers in the NFL who can genuinely put your entire team on his back. You hop on this guy's back, and he has the potential to drop 30-plus points in any random matchup. Now, is he going to average 30 points on the year? Of course not. That is crazy. But he's going to have these humongous games that really win you your week. If you look back to last year, week 1, he scored 37 points. If you look back week 15, 32 points, 32.8 points. Week 20 up against Buffalo in the playoffs, 31.8 points. This is a legitimate wide receiver. In week 4, this motherfucker scored 47.6 points. 47.6 points. He burned Darius Slay. Again, I'm not here to just tell you too much about a player you already know a lot about, but Tyreek Hill still going to get high praises from myself. Next up, we move to another old head, Davante Adams, wide receiver of the Green Bay Packers, 29.2 years old for Mr. Davante Adams in 2021. He had 169 targets, 10.6 per game, ranking 2nd at wide receiver, 123 receptions, 7.7 per game, ranking at number 2 at the wide receiver position, 1,553 receiving yards, 97.1 per game, 3rd at wide receiver, and 11 total tugs, 6th at the wide receiver position. Now, the hinge point of Davante Adams, I don't think Davante Adams is going anywhere. I think if he wants to leave, his ass is getting franchise tagged. So he's stuck in Green Bay for at least one more year. The biggest question is what happens with Aaron Rodgers. Does Aaron Rodgers say, fuck this shit, I'm out, and goes to Denver, goes to Pittsburgh, goes to some other team? Or is it going to be one last ride, metaphorically again, to choke in the NFC Championship or choke in the playoffs again for Aaron Rodgers? What's it going to be? I don't know. But my best bet is that Rodgers is back and that Davante Adams has one more year of greatness. And then maybe he goes to another team, and I think he'll still be fine for at least a couple more years. So that's why I like Davante Adams as wide receiver number 7. Some people will say that, oh, Nick, if Rodgers leaves maybe after next year, then Adams is fucked. And maybe you want to make that argument. But I think even if he stays in Green Bay and Jordan Love's the quarterback, then he'll be just fine. So Davante Adams, wide receiver number 7. At number 8, we got another old head here, but before we go into that, please make sure if you have ended up enjoying, make sure to hit that like button as well as that subscribe button. I'd appreciate it a ton. We move to Stefon Diggs. Actually, real quick, we did see Davante Adams be the number 2 wide receiver in fantasy points per game last year, 21.5. Stefon Diggs, 28.2 years old in 2021, 164 targets, 9.6 per game. Spin that around, you get 6.9. Very nice. I like. Number 5 at wide receiver, 103 receptions, 6.1 per game, ranking 8th at wide receiver, 1,225 receiving yards, 72.1 per game, ranking 7th at wide receiver, and 10 total tugs. Number 7 at the wide receiver position. Last year, he finished number 9 in fantasy points per game with 16.8. Stefon Diggs, also another one of those quarterbacks that is just hitched, or one of those wide receivers, I should say, that is hitched to an excellent quarterback. There's a lot of arguments you can make for a couple of guys who are the best quarterbacks in the NFL. In my opinion, 1A, 1B is Josh Allen. Maybe you want to argue Aaron Rodgers. Maybe you want to make some other argument. I get it, right? I'm not here to argue about that either. But in my opinion, Josh Allen's one of the best receivers in the NFL. I believe that Stefon Diggs is the clear number 1 guy there. Gabe Davis will have some good games. Cole Beasley, if he's back next year, he may even have a couple solid games as well, right? That's just bound to happen. But Diggs is the number 1 guy there. The Bills are going to be this fucking force to be reckoned with again. Not like the Bills are going to fall off the edge of the earth. Stefon Diggs is still Stefon Diggs, but he's 28 however many years old, 28.9 years old, 28.2 years old, I should say. I don't fucking care about that at the end of the day. When I'm looking to do in Dynasty Fantasy Football is win my league, and I believe that Stefon Diggs is still going to be able to do that in 2022, just like he did in 2021, just like he did in 2019, obviously, or in 2020, I should say. A better season in 2020. Wide receiver number 3 is wide receiver 9 last year in points per game. I'm not worried at all. I love Stefon Diggs. Next up, we move to number 9, A.J. Brown, wide receiver of the Tennessee Titans, 24.6 years old. Now, a lot of people are going to have A.J. Green much higher than I do. That's okay. That's okay. But the reason why I'm a little bit lower on A.J. Brown is because this is a team that likes to run the football with aggression. This is a team with a quarterback in Ryan Tannehill who is pretty efficient. He's not some shit-tier quarterback, right? I'm not going to sit here and dog the guy. But at the end of the day, A.J. Brown's game isn't elevated by Ryan Tannehill. I think overall, A.J. Brown is going to be fine going forward, but I'm just not excited. And I don't know what it is, because he's like a very talented player. He's a freak athlete. He's 6 feet tall, 226 pounds. The guy's big. Now, I understand that his teammate back at Ole Miss, DK Metcalf, everyone's like, oh, this is the fucking huge NFL player. This is the guy that you want to be, right? This huge jacked man. And maybe you do want to be like him, right? Who doesn't, you know? Who's not trying to look like DK Metcalf? The guy's absolutely huge. But A.J. Brown doesn't get as much credit. But still, there's just something about your girl. There's just something about A.J. Brown that just concerns me. And it has nothing to do with him again. It just has to do with the Tennessee Titans. And I think, again, he is still going to probably end up being a top 12 wide receiver going forward. I just don't know if I want to hitch the wagon to him if I'm looking to win the next 2-3 years over a guy like Hill, Adams, Diggs. And that's why I've got him as wide receiver number 9. Last year, 105 targets, 8.1 per game, ranking 30th at wide receiver, 63 receptions, 4.8 per game, ranking 35th at the wide receiver position, 869 receiving yards, 66.8 per game, ranking 28th at wide receiver, and 5 total touchdowns, number 33 receiver. Again, not some bad player. Fantasy points per game, wide receiver 26. He only played in 13 games, but again, the points per game number doesn't lie, 13.9. And you may want to argue, oh, Nick, bad things happened. We got injured in some of these games. That's why he wasn't playing phenomenally. He had a game where he scored 31 points. He had 2 games over 31 points. He had these great games, and I understand that. I understand that he's a good wide receiver, maybe even a great wide receiver. But just how this Tennessee Titans team works, at least for the next couple of years, it's Derrick Henry season, and you know, that kind of just devalues A.J. Brown. At number 10, we move to CeeDee Lamb, wide receiver of the Dallas Cowboys, 22.9 years old. In 2021, 120 targets, 7.5 per game, ranking 21st at wide receiver, 79 receptions, 4.6 per game, ranking 20th at wide receiver, 1,102 receiving yards, 68.9 per game, ranking 14th at wide receiver, and 6 total touchdowns, number 20 at the wide receiver position. Now, the likelihood that Michael Gallup is back in 2022 seems pretty low. Seems like he's going to be a very sought-after free agent. Amari Cooper, how much longer is he going to be there once Cooper's gone? CeeDee Lamb's going to be the heir to the throne, right? He's going to be the number 1 receiver on the team. Dak Prescott looked flashy last year. And I'm talking about, or maybe streaky is the better term, right? Where he plays some good games, and then he kind of falls off the edge of the fucking earth, right? And just doesn't play well. And then he comes back and he's hot again. He looks great. And then he falls off the edge of the earth. And it's very concerning when you have your receiver on a team with a quarterback that's like that. Now, you might argue Nick Dak's one of the best quarterbacks in the NFL. Maybe he is. When he's on, he certainly looks like it. But that is a little bit concerning for Mr. Lamb. Last season, CeeDee Lamb was the wide receiver number 20 in terms of half PPR points per game, 14.6. Again, he's young. He's going to continue to get better. It's not like Dak Prescott's going to be gone or anything, and Dak is still a good quarterback. But again, these are just these kind of factors that scare me away from CeeDee Lamb in terms of ranking him super high. Now, again, still being a top 10, a top 12 wide receiver, all of these receivers are obviously good, right? But to me, CeeDee Lamb just doesn't have the thing that would elevate me to be for him to be a top 5 wide receiver, like a guy like Jefferson, Kupp, Chase, Samuel, Waddle have. So that's kind of just my read on that. Next up, we move to wide receiver number 11, Mr. DK Metcalf, wide receiver of the Seattle Seahawks, 24.2 years old, wide receiver, 22.5 PPR points per game last season, 129 targets, 7.6 per game, 14th at wide receiver, 75 receptions, 4.4 per game, 25th at wide receiver. He had 967 receiving yards, 56.9 per game, ranking 25th at wide receiver, and 12 total touchdowns, 5th at the wide receiver position. Now, when it comes to DK Metcalf, there is going to be a lot of disappointment when you play him. There's going to be a lot of triumph. He's going to have these streaks where he rocks, where he's great, where Lockett isn't involved, and then Metcalf plays amazing. But then once Lockett starts getting the ball more, then Metcalf falls off the edge of the earth. And I almost said, fuck it, and put Metcalf outside of the top 12. There probably would have been tomatoes being thrown at me virtually through the screen. There would have been dislikes on this video, but that's just how I feel about it. I think he's a streaky wide receiver. I think he's a good receiver. He's fast as fuck for being, let's see how much he weighs. This man is 6'3", 228. And he runs super fast, right? He runs a 4.33 40 98th percentile at the receiver position. So he's clearly fast. He's clearly good. Will Russell Wilson be back? That's up in the air. That is certainly up in the air. He's one of those wide receivers. He was wide receiver 14 in 2021 overall. That gets elevated by the fact that he played in all 17 games. That's why we really look and hone in on that points per game number, whereas wide receiver 22. Will Russell Wilson be back? I don't know. Seems like he wants out, but I don't really ever see Russell Wilson wearing a different jersey. I'm surprised Pete Carroll wasn't fired. Not that I think Pete Carroll is a bad coach, but because it seemed like that's where things were trending. Hey, let's lose Pete Carroll. Let's keep Russ. Now, is Pete Carroll still, good with Russ? I don't know. It seems like it, but you never really fucking know, right? I'm not a Seattle Seahawk, right? I'm not in the locker room. But see, again, DK Metcalf, another one of those guys that I think's a great receiver. He's on a solid team. It's just, I just don't really see him elevating himself to be that top 5 guy. He was a top 10 wide receiver last season in times of points per game, or in 2020, I should say, 17 points per game. So he could definitely do it. He has it in him. I just don't really see him being a top 5 guy. Closing in on the top 12, we have another wide receiver with quarterback issues, but he also had quarterback issues last year because he's on the Steelers. That's Diontae Johnson, wide receiver of the Pittsburgh Steelers, 25.3 years old. Sir drops a lot is what people were calling him last year. 17.2 points per game, number 8 at wide receiver. I guess that's what people were calling him in the offseason. The reason why he earned that nickname in 2020 was because the guy was just dropping the ball left and right. He couldn't hold on to the ball, but last year, I think he did in 2021, he did have maybe a drop or two, but it was nothing egregious. Whereas in 2020, like, man, oh man, like the ball would be right in the fucking breadbasket, right? He's going to catch it and then it just falls out. So he did still struggle a bit with drops in 2021, but not as much in my opinion. He definitely worked on that and made that a point. He was the wide receiver number 8 in half PPR points per game with 17.2, 169 targets, 10.6 per game, ranking second at wide receiver, 107 receptions, 6.7 per game, ranking fifth at wide receiver, 1,161 receiving yards, 72.6 per game, ranking ninth at wide receiver, and he had 8 total touchdowns, 13th at the wide receiver position. Big Ben's going to be gone. Someone else new is going to be there. Will it be a rookie? I wouldn't love that. Will it be Derek Carr? Could it be Aaron Rodgers? Could it be someone else? Definitely. Could be anyone. Your guess is as good as mine, right? We don't really know right now. But I think that as long as the quarterback doesn't suck complete and utter ass, like with Big Ben, Johnson was good, right? And Big Ben was far from the Big Ben of the past last year. So not too worried about Diontae Johnson, but that is definitely something to discuss when you're ranking him, because otherwise I'd rank him above Metcalf. Only 1 year older than Metcalf, and I think he's just in a better position. If the quarterback position was more cemented there, even though it's not super cemented in Seattle, I just think Russell Wilson is going to be the guy. So thank you guys all so much for watching today's video. Let me know down below in the comment section what you guys thought. Maybe you thought, oh, Nick, you fucking idiot, you ranked this guy there. Should have had another guy in the top 12. Just let me know down below in the comments. I love talking to you guys. Love you guys all. Hope you have a great guys' day. As always, happy Friday. Goodbye.